This is the immune system, with special thanks to Dr. Peggy Stoll, who helped out with some of the blood cells and identifications and imagery you find in this presentation. So what is the function of the immune system? I think most of you could come up with an answer pretty close to correct about what your immune system does. It functions to fight off foreign substances and clean up damaged cells inside of your body. These foreign substances that might get inside of your body are known as antigens. That is a definition. Antigens are foreign substances that enter the body. Anything basically that shouldn't be there. There are important organs of immunity inside of your body. These include your thymus, which is located right here, kind of central, right under your sternum, your breastplate. And it's responsible for the maturation of T cells. I mean, they're called T cells because they mature in the thymus. You also have bone marrow, which we've talked about before related to the skeletal system. It's the bone marrow where all of your blood cells are actually created, including your white blood cells. Your lymph nodes, which are filters for the fluid that leaves your circulatory system, and your spleen, which is a filter for the blood as it circulates around your body. All of these basically have something to do with white blood cells, including lymphocytes, which are a specific kind of white blood cell. So having said all that, what would you say is the functional unit of the immune system? Yep, that's right, it's the white blood cells. They will be your functional unit of defense. And white blood cells come in many different types, many different sizes, many different functions. But they are all of them, of your immune response. Some of the white blood cells you might find in your body include monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and lymphocytes, which also actually come in a few different types. We're going to learn some more about these in the next slides. So let's see, types of white blood cells. Your neutrophils protect the body, especially against bacteria. They engulf and destroy them. So basically they can eat them. They're a little bit like an amoeba almost, in how they can kind of surround and engulf bacteria. Basophils are involved in allergic reactions, and they can release histamines. If some of you may know that histamines are the trigger compound for most of your allergic symptoms. Additionally, basophils have another substance within them that helps prevent blood clotting within the blood. It's called heparin. Those of you that may have doctors around the house might have heard of heparin, especially if you have a cardiologist. It's something that is prescribed for people to help thin the blood and prevent it from clotting. Eosinophils are another type of white blood cell that is also associated with allergic reactions. Additionally, eosinophils can also have a function against parasitic worm infections. So yeah, let's wrap our head around that one. Parasitic worm infections have been a problem for humans for so long that there's actually a blood cell, an immune cell, that is specifically designed to help target them. Okay, moving on. Monocytes are another cell that eats things. The term phagocytize means to eat, and they eat basically dead and destroyed cells that might be in your tissues, or in the blood, or wherever they find them, really. And then the last main group of white blood cells are your lymphocytes. And it's the lymphocytes that can provide immunity against specific diseases. There are a few different kinds of lymphocytes. Some of them can develop into plasma cells, which are the ones responsible for creating antibodies. Other lymphocytes are designed to just remember an antigen so that if they come in contact again, they can signal the immune response. Some lymphocytes are signalers, just generally signalers, but that's about it. So let's look at what some of these look like. Neutrophils, as we already said, are the ones that can eat bacteria. If you see them under the microscope, they actually have 3 lobes to their nucleus, which means they have a nucleus with 3 parts. And you can see that in each of these pictures, these 2 diagrams here on the left and in the middle. You can see 1, 2, 3 parts to this nucleus, and 1, 2, 3 parts to this nucleus, and 1. This is an actual microscope picture, 2, 3 parts to that nucleus. Okay, so neutrophils have 3 parts to their nucleus, and they also have a relatively clear cytoplasm, so you can sort of see through it. This picture that you see over here on the right, these guys are red blood cells, just so you know. And these tiny little guys are platelets. Just thought I'd share that. And then we can go on to the next page. Basophils are also involved in allergic reactions and can cause problems sometimes because they're the ones that act a little crazy when you have a chronic allergic disease like asthma, or maybe an allergic anaphylactic reaction to, say, bee stings or something. It's these guys that sort of get out of control. The other thing they do is they help with blood clotting. They're not as common in the blood normally. They're really granular because all of those little packets of histamines and packets of heparin that prevent the blood clotting are located, all over the cytoplasm of these guys. So they have tons of little vacuoles for storing these substances. And when you stain them, when you apply a dye so that you can see them better under the microscope, all of those little vacuoles take up that dye, and what happens is you basically have a cell that turns into kind of a purple blob because all of the dye gets concentrated in all those little vacuoles, and you can't even see the nucleus really anymore. So even though they have 2 lobes on their nucleus, when you dye them, all you see is a blob of dye, basically. Okay, so you can see that in this picture. The picture on the left shows no dye. That's this one. And then the actual microscope picture on the right shows your little basophil with no cytoplasm visible, just a blob that has a whole bunch of dye concentrated in all the little vacuoles inside of the cell. All right. Eosinophils, that's a tough word to say, also associated with allergic reactions and parasitic worm infections like we mentioned before. They look a little bit like your neutrophils in that they have a lobed nucleus, but instead of 3 lobes, which is what you see in the neutrophils, these guys have 2 lobes. So see, we got 1 part here, 1 part here. Okay, 2 lobes. 1, 1. All right. When you stain them or dye them, they, even though they do have some granulation to them and some sort of grainy bits, that's what I mean by that, they don't pick up the stain or the dye quite as heavily as the basophils do. So you still can sort of see through the cytoplasm and distinguish the nucleus versus the rest of the cell, or the 2 parts of the nucleus versus the rest of the cell. So that's one of the ways you can tell the difference between these 2 allergy-related cells. Next comes your monocytes. And you may notice here that monocytes are a bit bigger than some of the other cells we've been talking about. Most of these other cells range in the sort of 2 times a red blood cell size. Monocytes are closer to 3 times a red blood cell size. And the thing that distinguishes these guys who like to eat cellular debris is they have a large kind of U horseshoe shaped nucleus. So see this sort of U shape, U shape, U shape, horseshoe nucleus, okay, with visible cytoplasm around it. And they are quite large, so that's another kind of distinguishing characteristic you can look for is the large size. As a side note, monocytes can leave the blood and enter the tissues of the body. And when they do, they turn into one of 2 other cells. They either turn into what's known as a macrophage, which is this guy up here on the top left, or they turn into a cell that's called a dendritic cell, which is this cell over here on the bottom right. And here on the bottom left, you can see a monocyte in the blood looks a little bit more rounder, so it rolls and it flows in the blood a little bit better. But if it has to leave the blood, it starts looking a bit more like an amoeba-like cell. And that's partly has to do with some of its function because these guys, as we've already talked about, are capable of eating up cellular debris and actually eating up invaders as well. So being amoeba-like is handy for that purpose. The last type of white blood cells we're going to mention here are lymphocytes. And it's the lymphocytes, again, that can provide specific immunity against specific antigens or specific diseases or invaders. It is this group of white blood cells that are capable of producing antibodies, which we're going to talk more about antibodies later. They have a really large nucleus with not very much cytoplasm, but they do have cytoplasm. So if you'll recall, our basophils sort of look like a big purple blob with nothing else there. These guys still have a big purple blob, but you'll notice that there's this little sliver of cytoplasm around them. And you can see that in the diagram over here too. There's a small sliver of cytoplasm that you can see through, that's clear, that surrounds them. And so that's how you can distinguish them from the basophils. There are 3 major types of lymphocyte cells. There are T cells, which are involved in recognition and signaling, and they mature in the thymus, which is the reason why they're called T cells. There are B cells, which are also involved in recognition and signaling, but most importantly produce antibodies. These guys mature in the blood, and it is why they are called B cells. And then you have your cytotoxic killer cells, which are also actually T cells, so they mature in the thymus, but they're for killing infected cells or abnormal cells. So any cell that isn't the way it's supposed to be, these guys are responsible for eliminating before they can cause problems with other healthy cells around them. As a side note, these killer cells also can recognize tumor cells and cancer, and so they're able to destroy some cancer cells as well. Obviously, they're not always fully successful at doing that, but there are other circumstances and other reasons why that is that we're not going to go into right now. All right, so here's a little quiz for you. What is the name of this particular white blood cell? You'll notice that it has a large nucleus and a little sliver of cytoplasm around it. And if you remember correctly, you will remember that this is a lymphocyte. Okay, so this is what your lymphocytes look like. This particular cell has 2 lobes and a kind of grainy looking cytoplasm. So not very clear, 2 lobes, not really a horseshoe shape, it's not really a U-shaped, it's 2 distinct pieces. So this is actually an eosinophil. This one is a very large cell, okay? It has a horseshoe or U-shaped nucleus with quite a bit of cytoplasm around it. This, if you remember, and you can also think of this as being almost like an M, if that helps you remember, is a monocyte. And then there's this one, which has 3 distinct lobes. So 1, 2, 3. Fairly clear cytoplasm, good size, not huge, but good size. This is actually a neutrophil. Great. Here's a picture of what normal bone marrow looks like. If you'll remember, blood cells all originate in the bone marrow. Bone marrow is found on the spongy ends of some of your large bones, also in your pelvis. But you may not have realized that there is a lot of bone marrow in your spine, okay? So this is a cross-section through the vertebrae of a human, and you can see all of these sections here are all red marrow, which are responsible for making blood cells. I wonder if any of you remember what the stem cell that's found in the marrow is called, the one that's responsible for making all the blood cells. You'd have to think way back to our skeletal system when we did that. They are called hematopoietic stem cells, okay? But I wanted to point out that there's actually another name that's used for these guys called hemocytoblasts. Both of those mean the same thing. The root of hemocytoblast actually means blood cell sort of former or creator or builder. That's what hemocytoblast means. So if you'd prefer to know hemocytoblast because that's easier to remember, you're welcome to just sort of go with that. But either name will work, hematopoietic or hemocytoblast. What you can see in this diagram is there are 2 pathways for cells to form from hemocytoblasts or hematopoietic stem cells. The myeloid path leads to megakaryocytes, which can produce platelets. So these guys, this is just the scientific term for a platelet. They can also make red blood cells. That's erythrocyte is a scientific name for red blood cells. They can make mast cells, which are a special cell found in the tissues that deal with allergic responses. And myoblasts, which are another kind of stem cell that can produce all of these cells down here. So the basophil, neutrophil, eosinophil, monocyte all come from myeloblasts, that come from the myeloid progenitor cell from the hematopoietic stem cell. All right. And then lastly, the monocyte can turn into either macrophages or dendritic cells in the tissues. The second development from these hematopoietic stem cells are called lymphoid progenitors. And these guys can turn into lymphocytes, both the B and the T lymphocytes. And the B lymphocytes can turn into plasma cells. And they also can turn into these killer cells. So all of these cells here, there's quite a few, originate from these hematopoietic stem cells. Pretty impressive. I'm just going to erase really fast, make it a bit easier. All right. All right, here's another picture of bone marrow. This picture, you may notice, looks a bit different than the first picture I showed you. It's not as varied, okay? I know it's not as magnified, but if you look closely, where before we saw lots of different types of cells in our field of view, this particular picture looks almost like they're all the same cell. And so what you're seeing here is actually a kind of leukemia, where your bone marrow starts overproducing a particular kind of blood cell, and it sort of crowds out and takes over all of the space in the marrow and ultimately gets released into the blood and is crowding out stuff in the blood. And the other problem with sort of overproduction and crowding is these cells are getting made so quickly that they're not even functioning the way that they're supposed to function. So if it's a particular kind of white blood cell that's being made and is being made super fast and it's not really maturing, then it's not going to protect you from invaders as well as a cell that was produced normally. Okay, so you can see how things could go badly really quickly when it comes to leukemia and cancer. All right, so we're going to talk some more about your immune response and what's involved in it. There are three main lines of defense in your immune response. The first two lines of defense are actually non-specific. And what I mean by that is that they will block anything. Doesn't matter what it is, they will try to block it from getting into your body. There are two main phases to these non-specific types of defense. The first line has to do with physical and chemical barriers. So if you think for a second, what is your main physical barrier that prevents things from entering your body? I think, or I hope most of you pretty quickly would come up with skin. And then if you think on places where you have openings in your body, your mouth, your ears, your nose, you'll start to think of things like, oh, there's hairs in there, there's mucus in there, there's saliva in your mouth, there's tears in your eyes that help flush things out instead of flush things in, right? So all of these provide physical and chemical barriers to things getting into your body. Okay, that is your first line of defense. Your second line of defense has to do with how your body reacts once an invader does get inside. Okay, there are two parts to your initial non-specific reaction in the second line of defense. The first one has to do with something called an inflammatory response. These are usually triggered by those basophil and eosinophil cells, the ones that can release histamines and such, because they can cause swelling, they can cause heat, and ultimately fever if it's really bad, redness, okay? All of those things are part of an inflammatory response, and those can actually help slow down the division and invasion of a particular antigen in your body, especially bacteria, but they can work somewhat on viruses as well. The second component to your second line of defense has to do with some white blood cells, and it's some of the ones that we've already talked about. So your neutrophils, if they come across any bacteria, it doesn't matter what it is, they will try to kill them. Your monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells will also try to engulf any pathogen that they come across, and they will clean up any destroyed cells that they come across. And then those cytotoxic killer cells will destroy any body cell that they find that's been infected, no matter what it's been infected by. Okay, so all of these are still non-specific. They're going to attack anything that they come across and find, okay, no matter what it is. And you can see some of these cells in the bloodstream here. You can see your basophils here, your mast cells that are in the tissue releasing histamines. You can see your natural killer cells ready to attack any body cells that they find that are infected. You can find these phagocytes, which are the ones that eat things, your monocytes, neutrophils, and macrophages. So those are your second line of defense. Your third line of defense is specific. Okay, so these defenses are designed to actually identify the invader and produce defenses specifically geared towards destroying that invader, that antigen. So in your body, for each antigen that you come across, our immune system has the ability to generate a specific lymphocyte that has a receptor that will bind to it and tag it, and it'll allow it to recognize it, and it'll allow it to alert other parts of your immune system to help come and destroy it. Ultimately, it results in this sort of coordinated cascade of reactions between several cells, and ultimately the production or generation of what we call smart cells that can target, as we said, and recognize that specific antigen. And sort of how they do it, if you look at this particular dendritic cell here, which they're calling an antigen presenting cell, these second line of defense cells, when they come across an antigen, they can actually break up the cellular components of this antigen, including the little surface proteins on the outside of these cells, and they can put them on their own membranes and wear them like sort of stickers almost, if you want to think of it that way. And these stickers are designed to teach your T lymphocytes and your B lymphocytes how to recognize the invader. Okay, so they put all these little stickers that came from the antigen on the outside of their cells. The T lymphocytes and the B lymphocytes come up. They start trying to match them. Like they start trying to create sort of lock and key things that will fit onto these pieces of the antigen. And once they have identified it and they have a lock and key, a good match, they can then start dividing and turning into more specialized cells that can go out and try to attack the antigen and the invader. Ultimately, the B cells will make those plasma cells that will produce antibodies, the ones that can actually attach directly to the antigen. And those antibodies, once they're attached, act like little flags of like, hey, immune system, over here, destroy me. Okay, it's just a way of marking the things that need to be killed. So the smart lymphocytes, what exactly are there? There's several different types. You have your helper T cells, and as the name suggests, they help. Okay, they're the ones that actually signal the B cells to start dividing and to come over and start figuring out what the antigen is so that they can start making antibodies. And so once the B cells come over and start dividing and figure out what the antigen is, maybe not quite in that order, maybe it's more like the B cells come over, figure out what the antigen is, and then start dividing and producing antibodies. The cytotoxic killer T cells have also divided a bit more, so there's more of them to go around and kill any infected body cells that they find. And then there's a special cell called the suppressor T cell. These guys are really important because once you're done fighting off an invader, you need to kind of have your army stand down. Okay, you don't want all of those cells running around in your body looking for things to destroy at really high levels because they might make mistakes, okay? And you don't want your immune system to accidentally start targeting your normal healthy cells. So these suppressor T cells will signal when it's over, okay? We've destroyed the invader, everybody's happy, army, start destroying yourself. We don't need that many of you anymore. You can stand down, okay? So the cells start self-destructing. The cytotoxic, or not the monocytes and all those guys start cleaning up the, finish cleaning up the cellular debris. And if there's any extras of those, they also destroy themselves. The only thing that really sticks around are memory T cells and memory B cells. And these guys are designed to live for a long time. They can live for years. And they circulate in the blood just in case you happen to come in contact with that antigen again. in which case they can mount the attack really quickly and hopefully fight off that invasion before you even get sick. So what does an immune response look like? It doesn't exactly look like that picture. So, first scenario, if the antigen has not been seen before, then the invader or the antigen is going to have to be found by B cells or notified by macrophages or monocytes or those dendritic cells that they've found something that could be a problem, all right? And those macrophages, monocytes, and dendritic cells will place pieces of that antigen on their own cell membranes that the B cells can then start trying to figure out what they are. So what that looks like is here you can see this antigen presenting cell. So that's either a monocyte, a macrophage, or a dendritic cell, has placed bits of the antigen on the outside of its cell. These B cells are coming up trying to recognize what it is, okay, and they're trying to develop an antigen-specific receptor on the outside of their cells. Once they've figured it out, they start producing them and putting them on the outside of their cell. And then there's a big signaling cascade reaction that happens that ultimately leads to these B cells forming what's known as a plasma cell. And it is the plasma cell that will produce all these antibodies that can go and then target and tag your antigen. Okay, it is also these B cells that will trigger other T cells and other things going on in the region. Okay. Helper T cells recognize the B cell or the macrophage and will stimulate through chemical messenger the B cells to produce plasma cells, as we just said, which will make the antibodies. Memory B cells that can recognize the antigen will stick around and will also be made just so that they can stay circulating once the fight is over. And it'll allow the immune system to have a memory and recognize that antigen in the future. The other thing that gets stimulated by the helper T cells are more macrophages and more cytotoxic T cells. For clarification, an antibody is a special marker that functions by binding to a specific antigen in order to alert the immune system of the antigen's presence. They act as an alarm system and provide a way for the antigen to be deactivated or to signal other cells to destroy the antigen. Okay, so they can, because they bind on the outside of these cells, if they fill up enough of the binding sites on the cell membrane of the antigen, that antigen can't interact with your cells, which means they can't invade them. All right, so if it's something that invades any of your body cells, they become unable to do that because they've been locked up with all of these antibodies all over them. So that's kind of cool. You can see an antibody looks like a weird T/Y shape, and on these upper bits of the TY are where you find these little antigen binding sites. Okay, and they can vary, they change. Oh, I just noticed that is variable instead of variable. That's weird. Anyway, these guys can be changed by the B cells according to whatever specific antigen they come in contact with. So they're specifically made to recognize a particular antigen/pathogen. Okay. Ultimately, this allows neutrophil cells that have appetites for bacteria and other antigens to locate those antigens and more quickly destroy them. Monocytes and macrophages will also come in and help find and fight off anything that might be in there, in addition to cleaning up any cellular debris from cells that were destroyed in the fight. The other thing that happens, of course, is those killer T cells come in and will kill any infected cells that have been invaded by that same antigen. And cytotoxic T cells also, those killer cells can also attack cancer cells, as we already mentioned. You have memory T cells that will circulate to search for the antigen in the future. You will also have suppressor T cells that we talked about that notify the immune system when the antigen has been destroyed in order to stop that immune response. The other thing about stopping your immune responses is when you're fighting heavily, when you're involved in a big immune response, it actually takes a great deal of energy, and you don't want to keep wasting that energy if the fight is over. So that's another reason why we need to stop the fight. The next, so basically what we just discussed is, excuse me, is the scenario that if you've never seen an antigen before, you have to go through all of these steps in order to create the right kind of cells to fight the specific antigen you're trying to fight. And during that time, when you're trying to develop all these cells that you need to fight the antigen properly, this is when people get sick and when they feel bad, okay? Because your body's investing all this time trying to develop what it needs to fight it. Meanwhile, your antigen, your invader, is doing the job of getting you sick, okay? If, however, the antigen has been seen before, those memory cells, those memory B cells and memory T cells, they begin to produce antibodies right away, because as soon as they recognize that invader again, they can signal an immediate mobilization of fighters to fight off that antigen. They'll notify other cells that the antigen's present, they'll produce those antibodies. All of that together means that you respond and are fighting that antigen much quicker, which usually translates to you not getting very sick. Win-win, okay? So again, memory cells, okay? These guys can turn into active plasma cells. These are the ones that make antibodies really quickly when they come in contact with the antigen. And generally, like I said, you can fight off the invader without getting sick. This is a video that I'm probably going to show in class. All right, so types of immunity. There are two main types of immunity that we talk about. One's called natural or innate immunity, which is related to genetics. You're basically born with it. And it's mostly related to your first and second lines of defense. So, how good are your physical and chemical barriers? How active and good are your monocytes or your neutrophils? Okay, that kind of a thing. The second kind of immunity is called acquired immunity. And this you get in your lifetime. And there's two ways that you can develop acquired immunity. You can get it actively, where you actually got sick, or maybe you got the vaccine, and you develop your own immunity to the antigen through that process, through that whole immune response that we already talked about. Okay, that's an acquired immunity. It can also be passive, where you get the immunity from another person. So like, how they've been talking about with coronavirus, how they're talking about taking antibodies from somebody who had the disease and injecting those antibodies into somebody who's fighting the disease, who's sick. That would be a passive way of acquiring an immunity, because those antibodies would then help you survive. But you didn't actually develop them. You could also think of it this way. So immunity, two parts. There's adaptive is the other name for acquired. Okay, so you have innate immunity or adaptive immunity. You have artificial or natural. That's another way to look at it. Okay, There are passive and active components to both of those, if you wanted to think of it that way. So again, you have that antibody transfer, which would be an artificial passive form, or an active immunization would be an artificial active kind of adaptive immunity. And natural immunities are ones that you get from maybe through your mother's milk is another way that you might get natural immunity, or by actually getting sick, by getting the infection and surviving it. All right, this leads us to allergies. Allergies are basically an overreaction of the body's natural defense system to antigens that are not dangerous. Okay, it's just your body basically sort of like Chicken Little crying, saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling, and going crazy when there's really not a threat. The immune system normally protects the body from viruses and bacteria by producing antibodies to fight them. In an allergic reaction, the immune system starts fighting substances that are usually harmless, things like dust mites, pollen, or even certain medicines, as though these substances were trying to attack the body. Okay, we call these substances allergens because they can cause this reaction. It is characterized by an excessive activation of certain white blood cells called mast cells, which are the allergy cells that are in the tissues, and basophils, and also, which we already talked about, also those eosinophils, okay? But it's mostly the basophils that cause the problem allergy reactions. It's instigated by a type of antibody called IgE, resulting in a massive release of histamines, causing an extreme inflammatory response. So this can be minor. It can be, a light rash, itchy eyes, runny nose, sneezing, but it can also be major and severe in the case where you have trouble breathing, your trachea starts closing up because everything starts swelling, nausea, diarrhea. You can have really massive reactions sometimes. So you see up here, okay, here's ragweed pollen. Some of you are familiar with ragweed. The first time an allergy-prone person runs across an allergen such as ragweed, okay, B cell recognizes the pollen, starts producing these IgE, starts producing the plasma cells, produces the IgE antibody, and he or she makes a large number of those antibodies, right? These IgE molecules attach themselves to mast cells, which are those tissue cells that are designed normally to try and help fight invaders, okay? But in this case, they're going to cause a problem with these allergens, okay? Because the second time that the person is exposed to ragweed, these mast cells, when they recognize the ragweed, release huge, powerful amounts of these histamines and these cytokines. And those are what cause the characteristic symptoms of the allergy, that cause your swelling, that cause your itchy eyes, that cause your sneezing, that cause all of that stuff. And if it does it in high enough degrees, if you have enough of these mast cells reacting inappropriately to this allergen, it can cause serious problems. Such as anaphylaxis, okay? And anaphylaxis is sort of a really strong reaction to an allergen. And as you can see, it can incorporate all or include all of these symptoms, which is a lot. And really annoying, I would think. I mean, when you think about it, your body is reacting, overreacting to something that shouldn't be a threat. Excuse me. Now, there are things that can affect your immune response. These things include nutrition, like your diet, whether you're eating well and getting the appropriate micronutrients that you need to keep your immune system happy and to have the supplies you need to build the appropriate cells that you need. your fitness level, your stress level, any pre-existing diseases that your body's already trying to deal with, which may make it hard for them to deal with a new one, and your genetics. If you look at the sort of diagram on your left, you can see that stress, actually hold on, I'll start here. Release of CRF from the hypothalamus is influenced by these factors: stress, blood level, cortisol, time of day, caffeine, sleep deprivation. So this CRF hormone, which is called cortisol releasing factor, is released from your hypothalamus under some of these conditions. It acts on the pituitary, which is also in your brain, which then releases this ACTH, which is another kind of hormone. It's like adrenal cortico something hormone, I can't remember the exact name, which influences your adrenal glands, which then release cortisol. And cortisol increases blood sugar, increases blood pressure, increases your immune response, increases an inhibition of inflammation, and increases dehydration, which is fine and dandy if you actually have something to fight. However, because of stress or sleep deprivation, if you're activating this hormone more often, the long-term effect is it actually weakens your immune system, which is not good. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So try, and here's another diagram down here, our little infographic about how sleep deprivation impacts your health, which it really does. So, and even some say not having a regular sort of sleep pattern, like a regular time of going to sleep and a regular time of waking up, that can also impact your health as well. So try. I know it's hard, but try to eat well, try to get a good amount of sleep, try to minimize your stress levels, and you will be healthier and happier for it, okay? There's another little video down here that I'll probably try and show you in class. A quick note on antibiotics. Antibiotics are substances that prevent the growth of some microorganisms, mostly bacteria, and they do this by preventing the formation of the cell wall in the bacteria. So when the bacteria are dividing, the cell wall can't form properly because of this chemical, this antibiotic that's been ingested by you. And therefore, it's harder for them to divide and grow, and it gives your body more time to find them and destroy them. Okay? I'm sure some of you have heard that taking antibiotics too much or too often or incorrectly can be problematic, and it has to do with the fact that bacteria do mutate over time and naturally have a lot of variation within their population. So if a group of bacteria is continually exposed to antibiotics through overprescribing, those bacteria, somewhere in the population, there might be a bacteria that is immune to the antibiotic. And if so, they'll survive and they'll start reproducing. And over time, they'll become the dominant trait in the population, which means you now have a whole group of bacteria that is immune to the particular antibiotic that you were taking, and you now have to find a different antibiotic that can fight them off. So don't take antibiotics unless you really need to, basically, bottom line. Okay, that's going to be it for the immune system. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. And thanks for listening. Have a good one.